In order to understand Andrew Jackson as a president, you must understand him as a person. So, I'm going to give you a quick bio of Andrew Jackson. He said this himself, and it's one of the best quotes describing him just as a human being. "I was born for a storm, and a calm does not suit me." That is the most accurate, concise description of Andrew Jackson you can possibly get. Jackson was born to poor immigrant parents. So Jackson would be the very first president who was actually born poor. So he is a self-made man, and he was born really poor. His parents were Irish immigrants. His father died when he was born. During the American Revolutionary War, he and his brothers were, of course, very pro-American, and so they went out and scouted for the Patriots. Well, long story short, some British soldiers found out that they had been spying. So, British officer and some soldiers went to Jackson's house. British officer sat in a chair, put his boot up, and told Jackson, polish it. Jackson, being Jackson, instead spit on it. So the officer pulled out a sword and sliced it, and Jackson had a scar down his face the rest of his life, you can always see. It was from a British officer. British then took him and his brother and threw them in prison. And they almost died there. Jackson's mother had to beg for their relief because they came down with some sort of a disease. Jackson's mother begged for their release. And they were eventually released. Jackson's brother died. But Jackson lived through that. His other brother, because he had two of them, died fighting for the Patriots. And then his mother went back to help other prisoners, and she will end up dying. So by the age of 14, Jackson is orphaned, and he insisted it was because of the British. Well, and it was kind of because of the British. It was because of the British. So he hates the British the rest of his life. He will take any opportunity to do anything he possibly can against the British. So 14, he's young, and he is now an orphan. A couple of years later, when he was 18, he received a huge inheritance from a family member. What do you do if you are 18 and you get a big inheritance? He spent it all on gambling and drinking. He loved horse racing, and that is consistent his entire life. When that didn't work, he taught for a little while, and then he got a law degree. Getting a law degree back then, it was not what it is today, especially when it was on in the Western Territories or new areas. So he moved to Tennessee. In Tennessee, he will meet the woman who will become his wife. Her name is Rachel Donison Robards. It's a funny story. He rented a room. This woman who was a widow who had a daughter named Rachel Donison Robards. Rachel was married to Captain Lewis Robards. Jackson fell in love with her. So it's the three of them in this house with the widow. Jackson's in love with this married woman, and Jackson made Captain Lewis's life so uncomfortable that Lewis Robards ended up fleeing the house and running it and just vanishing in 1789. So Jackson and Rachel, they waited a little while, and then she petitioned for a divorce, and they became romantically involved and were living together. They didn't realize this, but the divorce never went through. And so later on, it will turn out Jackson and Rachel had an improper marriage, and she was technically an adulteress. Obviously, today it's no big deal whatsoever, but keep that in mind because that will come up technically, very technically, and it's not a big deal. They had an improper marriage. When Jackson was in Tennessee, he then went on to become a lawyer, and eventually he will enter the U.S. House of Representatives. who entered in 1796, and he will be an all-out Jeffersonian Republican. So this is during George Washington's presidency, and he, of course, was completely against Jay's Treaty. If you remember the treaty between the United States and England to prevent a war with England, which the United States could not afford at the time. But Jackson, hating the British, he was furious about this. Jackson was so furious about this. And then he also got really mad at Washington because Washington replaced some Jeffersonian Republicans in public office. It wasn't the spoils system. This was Washington replacing some people from policy-making positions, which is normal business. We still do today. But Jackson was absolutely furious that Washington did that. He was so mad at all this that when Washington retired, Jackson will be one of the few congressmen who will vote against a resolution thanking George Washington. He was then made a Senate. He only stayed in the House from 1796 to 1797. He was then sent into the Senate, elected to the Senate from Tennessee, but he only stayed there 6 months and he left. As he will say later, he does not do well in Congress. In Congress, you're one of many voices, and you have to do some compromising, and that is not Jackson's personality. He does not have the personality to work with others. He has personality of telling everyone what to do, like a president. So he will leave there, and he will become a judge in Tennessee on the Supreme Court. Now, in 1806, Jackson will have one of his famous duels with a guy named Charles Dickinson. It was over horse racing, because of course it was. And back then, dueling was a gentleman's thing. You challenge someone to a duel. It was so people would watch what they say. And Dickinson agreed to the duel. Well, Dickinson was a crack shot. Dickinson was known to be able to shoot really, really well. And Jackson knew he could not outshoot Dickinson. So they get to the dueling ground, and Jackson, he wears like 8 coats. He has 8 coats, so he looks really, really big. And the way dueling works is 20 paces apart, and you take turns shooting. One person shoots, and then they have to stand there while the other person shoots. Well, Jackson knew he couldn't outshoot Dickinson, so he had all the jackets on, so he looked really big. And then he turned sideways. Dickinson aims his gun, fires. Jackson, you see, poof, hits the coat. Jackson stumbles back. Then Jackson aims very carefully, fires, and blows Dickinson's stomach out. Kills him. Well, Dickinson had hit Jackson, but hadn't killed him. The bullet had went into him, and then got so close to his heart that doctors could not remove it without killing him. So Jackson has a bullet in him, inside of him, next to his heart, from 1806 to his death in 1845. If you can imagine the daily pain of living with you can't imagine the daily pain of living with a bullet inside of you, hopefully. But Jackson had a bullet in him the rest of his life. According to the etiquette of dueling, you're not actually supposed to kill people. And so Jackson was ostracized by polite society for the way he handled the duels. Dueling is stupid, so don't try to think too hard about this, but people were very upset with Jackson for how he had handled it, and he was ostracized by a lot of polite society. So funny enough, who do you think he became friends with? Aaron Burr, the guy who killed Alexander Hamilton, because he was ostracized also. So, him and Burr became buddies. They were involved with something, Jackson was kind of involved with something called the Burr Conspiracy. Aaron Burr actually thought he could create his own country with him as king. It was a crazy idea that we don't actually know anything about because he didn't write anything down. We just know that the idea was out there, but it didn't work out. So Jackson has a bullet in him. He had a lot of military experience, and that is something he was just really good at. He was good at the military. And that led his military experience, invading Florida, during Monroe's administration, if you remember. Then he had some stuff with Native Americans, built him up for the War of 1812. In the War of 1812, that is where he will have oversees the Battle of New Orleans, where he becomes the hero in the United States. When I say the hero, it's of course because the hero with the capital H, they could just write in a newspaper, oh, the hero is in Tennessee this week, and everyone in the country knows, oh, that's Jackson. That's how popular he was. During the War of 1812, he will get his nickname, Old Hickory. The reason he got that is because one time he was insanely sick. I mean, like, he looked like he was on death's door, but he didn't want his soldiers to stop training. So he came out, just was so sick he couldn't even stand up. And he had his men tie ropes around his wrist and tie him between two trees. So he's just hanging there between these two trees from his arms, barking orders, march, left, right, and he does that for hours. And his men had so much respect for him, they called him Old Hickory, because hickory is one of the strongest pieces of wood there is. So he got his nickname Old Hickory. Also, during this period, in 1813, he had such an insane story that we don't have time for. He got another bullet in him. This one wasn't a duel. It was a bar fight, essentially, with these two guys named Thomas and Jesse Benton. It's such a good story that we don't have time for, but it was a brawl, and Jackson got a bullet in his arm. He was rushed upstairs, put in a bed, and there's so much blood coming out of Jackson's arm. It soaks the bed, soaks the ground, and starts dripping. People downstairs could see Jackson's blood dripping down. When the doctors finally got there, Jackson was like completely white. He had lost so much blood, the doctor said, we've got to remove his arm or he might die. When he said that, Jackson opened his eyes, grabbed the doctor by his shirt, pulled him really close to his face and said, I'll keep my arm, and then passed out completely. The doctor, knowing that, God forbid, Jackson lives through this, if he cut off his arm, the doctor was going to die. So the doctor left that bullet in him. That bullet stayed in his arm for 19 years. After 19 years, it started getting gangrene, or had to be removed. So doctors, 19 years later, will remove the bullet. And back then, it's just drink some whiskey and they yank it out of you. By that time, it's way later, Thomas and Jesse Benton had become supporters of Jackson politically. So Jackson sent the bullet back to Thomas or Benton and said, I believe this belongs to you. Benton sent it back and said, no, based on the laws of eminent domain, you live on some land long enough and you get that piece of land and said, you own this. So Jackson, he had 2 bullets in him for 19 years and 1 bullet in him for the majority of his life. So that is the kind of person Andrew Jackson is. He will come into office and he calls himself the president of the common man. He's the president of the people because he's the first president that didn't come from a rich family. He was a genuine self-made man. But it's kind of, that term is a bit misleading. Based on everything I mentioned, do you think he ever asked the public, what do you guys think about this? I need to know everyone's opinion before I make a decision. Of course not. If you were going to describe his governing style, it would be described as authoritarian. He did whatever he wanted. He didn't care about the laws, he didn't care about the rules, he didn't care about the Supreme Court, he didn't care about Congress, he didn't care about anything. He did exactly what he wanted. He demanded complete and total loyalty from everyone around him. And what he was really brilliant at, and he was extremely brilliant about this, is doing whatever the hell he wanted, and then after the fact explaining, here's why I did this for you, for the people. And he could explain everything in democratic terms. So he did what he wanted and then explained it in democratic terms in a way that people just loved. He was good at that, and he was really, really good at it. But he did whatever he wanted, and what he did was based on a lot on his aggressive personality. He was notorious to have a very short fuse, and he would use that to his advantage. He'd scare the hell out of people, like pretend to be, like start yelling, and then when they ran away, he'd be like, "Ha, they thought I was angry." He literally did that during the Bank War. He always thought people were criticizing him, and if anyone didn't even agree with what he says, he took that as a criticism and a slight. He never apologized. He did not believe in apologizing ever, and he never forgave. And he never shrank from violence at all. His rage, his anger, his temper was just notorious. He was what we would today describe as emotionally unstable. And in fairness, he had a bullet in him. I think I would be a cranky person. I know I would be a cranky person too if I had a bullet in me. And the only reason I'm willing to say this stuff about Andrew Jackson is because at this point, he's been dead almost 180 years. He is a scary person. If he said he's going to kill you, he is going to try to kill you. And he really, really means it, not just rhetorically. He is someone to be feared, and someone to be, especially his military career, you've got to respect it. I mean, he was just a tough, tough person. That is the background of the person that this period is named after, the Jacksonian era. And that is his background, and it's important to know his background to understand everything he will do as President of the United States.